unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. Kishore Mahbubani is widely regarded as one of Asia's most widely known diplomats, commentators, and strategic analysts. Having grown up in poverty in Singapore in the 1950s, however, there was nothing preordained about Kishore's success. But over the course of the second half of the 20th century, he would go on to become one of the most recognizable and revered diplomats of his generation. Mahbubani served in Cambodia, Malaysia, and the United States. He was permanent secretary at the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs and twice served as his country's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. He later served as founding dean of the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He chronicles his life journey in a new memoir titled Living the Asian Century, an undiplomatic memoir. Kishore's journey mirrors Singapore's own metamorphosis, and the book sheds equal light on his life as it does the Asian country's own improbable evolution. To talk more about the book, Kishore joins me from his home in Singapore. Kishore, it is so good to talk to you. Congrats on the book.
Thank you very much for having me, Milan.
So, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is a story about your life, but it's also a tale of Singapore's own journey through time. And I want to start at the very start of the book, where you write the following. The first stroke of good luck in my life was to be born in Singapore. I am absolutely sure that if I hadn't been born in Singapore, I wouldn't have had the life I have enjoyed. What makes you so confident in that assessment?
Well, one of the most provocative things I say a lot of the time is that since human history began, no society, no country has lifted up the standards of its people as quickly and as comprehensively as Singapore has done so. And, when Singapore became independent in 1965, and I was 17 years old then, our per capita income was the same as Ghana in Africa. It was $500. Today it's $88,000, higher than that of the United States and the United Kingdom. No other country has achieved this feat. And as a result of that economic growth, Singapore did well, and I did well too. And I also emphasize that, my family came as Hindu refugees from Pakistan after partition in 1947. That's why I was born in Singapore in 48. And they could have gone anywhere in the world. My parents had siblings in South America, in Africa, in Japan, Hong Kong, India, in all corners of the world. And quite remarkably, by accident, I ended up in Singapore. And I ended up, having opportunities to study, to learn, to educate myself that I think I would not have had anywhere else. Mainly because I came from a very poor family.
Well, that's actually a nice segue to what I wanted to ask you next. At the age of 13, your father was sent from Sindh to live in Singapore, where he worked as a menial worker in a textile shop. You write that, you sort of had this first realization that you were poor when you showed up at primary school in Singapore and you were put on a special feeding program, right? And it's clear throughout the book that growing up in poverty left a lifelong impression on you. So as you reflect back on your life sitting here today, what lessons do you think it taught you?
Well, I think looking back now, I must tell you that it wasn't fun being poor, okay? I can tell you, I remember at the age of 5 or 6, before primary 1, I used to walk past kindergartens and I would see the kids playing in the yards of the kindergartens. And I knew I could never, ever afford to be sent to a kindergarten. It cost money. That's a small example of a childhood memory of deprivation. And when I went to school at the age of 6, all the kids who were enrolled were put on a special feeding program. And I was discovered as one of the few 10 or 12 boys that were undernourished. And so every recess time, we had to go to the principal's office. And there was one pail of milk, one ladle, and all the 10, 12 boys would drink this from the same ladle and finish the pail of milk, And that's when I guess That's when I realized, gosh, maybe I'm, relatively speaking, quite poor. And but it wasn't just the poverty, because my father, unfortunately, since he was sent as a peon to work in Singapore, both his parents died when he was less than a year old. He was orphaned. He didn't have proper parental supervision. And at the age of 13, to be sent into what was then Wild West Singapore, he developed all kinds of bad habits: drinking, smoking, gambling, fighting. And, he could never hold down a job. And we often had debt collectors coming to our house with signs put on the door to say that, anything in this house could be sold to pay off the debts of my father, Mohandas Mahbubani. And it was even worse when the Chinese debt collectors came, because then these Chinese gangsters would beat you up if you didn't pay the debt. So my father would roll under a bed, and I would have to tell the Chinese gangsters, "Oh, my father is not home, my father is not home," So these were the kind of traumatic events I had growing up as a poor child in Singapore. But I believe that it also explains why I developed a very high degree of resilience in my life, because as I said, I didn't enjoy the poverty, but I believe it gave me a certain amount of strength and resilience that has been a great asset for me throughout my life.
I mean, speaking of strength and resilience, I wanna ask you about your mother. When you were young, your dad ended up in jail. Your parents eventually separated. You thank your mother in this book for keeping your family together. And you write that if she hadn't had a steel will, our family could have collapsed or become severely dysfunctional. Tell us a little bit about your mother and the role that she played in your life.
Well, and as you know, I got endorsements from my book from several people, including Martin Wolf of the Financial Times. And he told me after reading the book, he says, "Kishore, the real hero of your book is your mother, as you know." And he's right, because it was actually, looking back now, it's remarkable because, she was born and brought up in Sindh, which is now in Pakistan, in a very, sort of insular cultural environment. And there she was thrown, far, far away from her home into a distant place like Singapore, where she had no relatives at all, to discover that she had married a man through arranged marriage who had all these bad habits and wasn't supporting the family. And she had to cope on her own. And frankly, she could have and should have possibly broken down. But I don't know what inner strength she had. She never broke down. And, there were lots of trials and tribulations, debt collectors, not having enough money to pay for the bills, to go and buy food, waiting for the check to come from her brothers, waiting for the welfare check to be picked up. So, it was hell. And, my dad sometimes would lose his temper. And one Deepavali night, as I explained in the book, he decided he was so angry, he took all the new clothes and the new television set and set off a bonfire in front of our house on Deepavali Day, which, as you know, for Hindus, is supposed to be the happiest day of the year. So when I look back now at all those trials and tribulations, I sort of wonder, my God, how come she didn't break down at all? And so her refusal to break down was the biggest gift she could give to me, because I would have challenges regularly throughout my life, as I document in my memoirs. But each time when things would get very bad, all I had to say to myself was, "Well, my mother never broke down. She had far worse challenges. How can I break down?" So I soldiered on. And, that to me was a huge gift from my mother to me.
You came from a partition-era family from Sindh that migrated to Singapore. You write in the book that you have this Southeast Asian identity, and you feel that Southeast Asian identity is as strong as your Indian identity, and that culturally speaking, you feel equally at home whether you're in Indonesia or in India. Now, at the same time, you say that you were somewhat conflicted about your Sindhi identity because you and your mother didn't receive a lot of support from the local Sindhi community in Singapore when times were tough. Given how much time you've spent in Singapore throughout your life, and this is a show about India. How do you characterize the nature of your personal connection to India, throughout the years?
Well, I believe that the soul you develop comes with your mother's milk. And my mother was essentially a fervent Hindu nationalist. I believe that if she were alive today, she would be a great admirer of Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. She, as you know, had a very rough time. As you know, the Hindus, she could have almost been killed, as you know, in her escape from Pakistan. So when she came to Singapore, she had developed a very deep, antipathy to the Muslims of Pakistan and became a very fervent Hindu nationalist. And indeed was a great admirer too, by the way, of Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru. And as a child, I could read and write both Hindi and Sindhi. She made me learn both languages. And of course, the only music that I grew up with was the songs of Bollywood. And even to today, I cannot write anything at all. I cannot write a single page unless I put Mohammad Rafi or Lata Mangeshkar or Asha Bhosle on. Then I can start.
I mean, you talk about that. I think in the acknowledgments of your book, you say, in addition to thanking your friends and family, you have to thank Lata Mangeshkar, Asha Bhosle, and others.
Right? Yeah. And I'm serious because I'm trying to figure out why that happens. I think it's because that music sort of triggers the childhood neurons of my brain, because that's the music I grew up listening every day on radio with my mother, and of course going to see Hindi movies as a child. So I would say in that sense, I have very much an Indian soul, but at the same time, many Indians are not aware that the Indian soul has also penetrated Southeast Asia. And amazingly, even though geographically Southeast Asia is closer to China, geographically than it is to India, 9 out of the 10 Southeast Asian countries have an Indic base, and only Vietnam in Southeast Asia has a Sinic base. And that's remarkable. And I feel it most, intensely when I go to Indonesia, because in Indonesia they're still performing, especially in Java, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. It is what they call the shadow theater. And, in the middle of Jakarta, the President Suharto of Indonesia, who was then the president of the largest Muslim country in the world, when he had to put up a big statue in the main roundabout of the capital city, he has a huge statue of Arjuna and his chariot, a scene taken from the Mahabharata, And I think many Indians are not aware of this. And so there is an underlying Indian soul also in Southeast Asia, which is why I can feel very much connected also to Southeast Asia and India, culturally speaking.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendowment.org/NPC2025.
I want to ask you about your career because obviously, a big chunk of this book is about your various diplomatic postings and your really kind of front row seat at key moments in history. I want to start, though, with you as a college student, because when you were in college at the National University of Singapore, you developed a reputation as a pretty public critic of the Singaporean government. And the Singaporean government, has a reputation anyway, of not being particularly fond of dissenters. But you say, actually, your reputation as a critic could have helped you get recruitment into the Singaporean government. Well, why do you think that was the case?
Well, I mean, I would have, by the way, I should add here, I would have ended up in the Singapore government in any case, because the only reason why I went to university was because when I finished high school, I started working as a textile salesman, earning $150 a month. But then out of the blue, I got the President's Scholarship, paying me $250 a month. And so my mother said, okay, $250 a month is more than $100 a month, so go to university. And that's the only reason why I got to university, because of the President's Scholarship. But that bonded me to the Singapore government. But when I was in campus, I was, relatively speaking, quite outspoken. And one year when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew came to speak at the university, he was being harangued by a professor, actually one of my philosophy professors. And he asked the chairman of the meeting, a young Indian student like me, to end the harangue by the philosophy professor. And the young Indian boy refused to do so. So at that point, Lee Kuan Yew stood up and physically pushed that Indian student and said, I'm taking charge. And so I wrote a column entitled A Question of Decorum, saying that if prime ministers start pushing people around, this is a slippery slope to dictatorship. And I can tell you, after I wrote, I meant to publish it as an editorial from the entire editorial board of the student newspaper. But my fellow students were smarter than me. They said, Kishore, this is so well written. Why don't you put your name on it? They didn't want to have collective responsibility for an article that said that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was sliding into dictatorship. But in any case, that article got me noticed. I got interviewed by BBC, I got interviewed by New York Times, and I'm sure the leaders of Singapore took note of me. And I guess that's when they first began to be aware about me. So I guess when I joined, they must have paid special attention to me because they knew that who I was and that I could write reasonably well. And fortunately, of course, I did well in exams and I got a first-class honors in philosophy, which, by the way, was very difficult to get in those days. And so that's how my career started in the Singapore Foreign Service.
Speaking of Lee Kuan Yew, throughout your life, you had remarkable access to some of the most revered leaders of modern Singapore, not least Lee Kuan Yew. And you say that this level of access, it was flattering, it boosted your confidence, it made you feel like what you did had impact. But you also say that it made you feel a little bit cocky. It may have fueled your detractors within the foreign ministry. This is a pretty remarkably honest confession, Kishore. Is this something that you realized in real time, or is this something that was a product of kind of considered reflection after leaving government?
Recently, as you know, I was at the Jaipur Literature Festival. And at my session, I was interviewed by Amitabh Kant, the G20 Chairman of India. And before the session, we had a private chat. And he said to me, Kishore, your book is too frank. Why are you admitting these things? And why are you admitting that you have so many detractors, Why do you speak about that? And you shouldn't have put that in. And I said, well, I was trying to just give an honest description of my life. And it is true that for reasons I don't understand, I accumulated a lot of detractors, And this, of course, I realized, frankly, in retrospect, not then. But a lot of the detractors, I think, also resented the fact that I was treated very seriously, especially by the three key leaders of Singapore. The Singapore success is not due to one man. It's not due to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew alone. It's due to three great geniuses working together. Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, the architect of Singapore's economic miracle, and Mr. S. Rajaratnam, the long-serving foreign minister of Singapore. And I had a very special relationship with these three people because I would often engage in relatively long conversations with them, and they would be very interested in my views and in listening to me, sometimes challenging them and so on and so forth. I mean, that didn't mean that they agreed with me, but I believe that in my conversations with them, through a process of osmosis, I learned so much from them. And I believe that the only reason why I could have written 10 books as I have is because I sat at the feet of three geopolitical masters, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam, But I also believe that that special access, and I give us an example of how Dr. Goh Keng Swee got me to fly down from Kuala Lumpur 12 times, or 18 times rather, on, using the courier run. And because I was taking away the courier run from lots of my colleagues in the mission, they were so angry and resentful. But it wasn't my fault. I mean, I had no choice. I was instructed to do so by Dr. Goh Keng Swee. So I flew back 18 times to give 3 sets of 6 lectures on Marxism to the Singapore Armed Forces. Because at those days, in the 1970s, everyone thought that communism was on the march and would take over the world. So they said, okay, explain communism to us, which is what I did.
At one point, your minister approached you and asked if you would be interested in joining politics. And you described this kind of harrowing interview you had with Lee Kuan Yew. It was part of the process for gaining admission into the PAP, the ruling party of Singapore. And you characterized the interaction as a shelling, one which ultimately resulted in you not being asked to join the party. Tell us a little bit about this interaction and how you process this kind of rejection or this failure.
Well, I mean, to me, what was really shocking was that I never applied to join the ruling party, But what happened was that the then foreign minister, who was one of my best bosses, Mr. S. Dhanabalan, came to see me in New York once, as part of the UN General Assembly, and said, Kishore, we are looking for new talent to come into the party. We think you would be a good one. Why don't you apply? So I thought about it for a while. I said, okay, since it's a request from my minister, whom I respected a great deal, and since I got along very well with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, and Mr. S. Rajaratnam, I said, okay, I'll apply. And I did. So, in the initial interviews, all went well, and I thought, gosh, okay, things are going well. So I had to go for the final interview with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and it was one of the most bruising encounters I've ever had in my life, because Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, I can tell you, was one of the toughest human beings I've ever met. And if he decides to, give you a shelling, it's like getting incoming artillery fire from 1,000 guns at you, because he's amazing. He can be very harsh and brutal in the statements he made. I mean, for example, he would just ask me out of the blue, why don't you have any friends? I gave him a long list of my friends, but he wasn't impressed. But anyway, but the end result of it is that I wasn't selected for politics, and I could have spent the rest of my life regretting that. But as it turned out, frankly, it turned out to be a blessing for me, because I ended up being able to have an independent career, as a writer, as a commentator, and that I couldn't have done if I had gone into politics. So I always believe in my life that every time I've had a downturn, in one way or another, it has proven to be a blessing. And so that rejection to prove to be a blessing too.
Well, what's remarkable about the story is that, you continued to meet privately with Lee Kuan Yew to discuss matters of foreign policy, even after this disappointing experience. I mean, did that create a kind of cognitive dissonance that on the one hand, you had this bruising experience in trying to get into the party, but on the other hand, he used to rely on you regularly to discuss and brainstorm about, the kind of global agenda?
Yes, in fact, that bruising encounter I had with him was probably in 1988. And then I came back from New York to Singapore in 1989, and I spent about the next decade in Singapore. And after Mr. Lee Kuan Yew stepped down as Prime Minister in 1990, he had more time in the 1990s, and he would invite 3 of us, Ambassador Tomiko, Ambassador Chan Eng-chi, and myself, regularly for lunches at the Istana. And having lunch with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was a real privilege, because, he'd be very relaxed and very open and very curious, and we would have fascinating conversations with him. And the thing about Mr. Lee Kuan Yew is that after he gives you a shelling, it's done, it's forgotten, we move on, and you go on to the next chapter. So, in fact, my subsequent encounters with him, by the way, I did have some ups and downs. You always do with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. In fact, if you talk to all the senior civil servants or even some of the ministers in Singapore, they all carry as a badge of honor saying, I too was beaten up by Lee Kuan Yew once.
But, one of the most surprising anecdotes about these meetings, Kishore, is that you would have this, elite group that would meet for lunch and have this kind of, tour of the world where you talk about Russia, you talk about the United States, Europe, Southeast Asia, India, so on and so forth. And that you're sitting in what many people believe is one of the best countries for global for food, for cuisine, and he used to give you these really bland lunches.
Yes, I mean he was not a foodie, but he liked to eat a lot of fruit. And but for him, the most important thing is the conversation and the company. And the thing about Lee Kuan Yew is that he could, on the one hand, be a brutal taskmaster, and on the other hand, when he switches on his charm, he can be incredibly charming. And the other privilege I had was to sit in on dinners when he had with foreign dignitaries, lunches and dinners. And those conversations were amazing. And I can tell you that people who got a chance to talk to Lee Kuan Yew were very, very impressed by him. I think in my memoirs I tell the story. I was in St. Petersburg, Russia for a meeting where lots of American luminaries were there. Father Bush, President George H.W. Bush, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel Huntington, they were all there. And in the course of that meeting, David Frost, the legendary British broadcaster, interviewed George H.W. Bush. And one of his final questions was, President Bush, you met so many world leaders. Tell me, which world leader has impressed you the most? And in a split second, without even thinking, President George H.W. Bush said, Lee Kuan Yew. I mean, that's amazing. Can you imagine? George H.W. Bush has probably met every world leader from every continent. And immediately he said Lee Kuan Yew. Therefore, Lee Kuan Yew's mind was an amazing mind, And to have the privilege of spending time with him when he's talking to other world leaders, and to sit there and listen to those conversations was remarkable. And I hope that someday the Singapore government will declassify some of the conversations that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had with world leaders, because you'll be amazed at his wisdom and his sagacity and his capacity to analyze situations.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So I want to ask you about some of your conversations. You served twice as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations in New York. During your second stint in New York, Singapore was a member of the Security Council, and I found it very interesting that you wrote, you learned more about the state of global affairs from these 26 months on the Security Council than you had from 29 years as a career diplomat. What were some of the kind of eye-opening lessons you took away from this period?
Well, I think the key point here is that until we joined the Security Council, I sort of assumed more or less that, in international relations, of course, brute force, brute power mattered a lot. But it would also be conditioned by some degree of principles and some idealism, and what international relations is about, how you have a balance between the two. But in my 26 months in the UN Security Council, I learned at the end of the day, it's just brute force that decides everything. You can throw away your principles, because when powerful national interests are at play, that's what carries the day. And I give a simple example in my memoirs of how when I was president of the UN Security Council, I received a request from the head of the World Court, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, saying he wants to give a briefing to the UN Security Council. So I thought, what can possibly be wrong about the president of the World Court giving a briefing to the UN Security Council? So I raised it in the informal consultations, and everyone said yes, but the United States delegation, and at that time, the president of the United States was George W. Bush, So his delegation said, sorry, we object to this briefing. So we discussed it a bit more. Then I finally turned to the American delegation. I said, well, at the end of the day, this is a procedural question as to whether or not we should invite the president of the World Court. So why don't we have a vote? Because on procedural questions can be decided by a vote. And there's no veto, as you know, in procedural questions. So the American delegation was much smarter than me. They said, Mr. President, the question as to whether or not this is a procedural question or a substantive question is a substantive question. Therefore, we will veto it. Very direct, very blunt. And I thought, my God, if you can't even get, a briefing by the president of the World Court, the UN Security Council, and by the way, it's not just the United States, okay? All great powers would do the same. And there was also, frankly, something that is not well known to many people, that in some ways there is often a lot of silent collusion among the P5, And I learned indirectly, and to be honest with you, one of my first secretaries happened to be sitting in a restaurant listening to two P5 members talking among themselves. And then when they came to some point, they said, well, I think let's just take it away from the council. Let's just discuss it among the five of us. And this happens regularly. And even today, I can tell you, even when at the height of all the problems between United States and China and United States and Russia, the P5 collusion continues. And that's when I realized, and quite often when the P5 met and decided something, frankly, the rest of the Security Council will roll over and say, okay, we'll go along with you, right? And that to me was a real eye-opener. And I told myself, this is why the leaders of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam were such geopolitical realists, because at the end of the day, it's about power. And this is something that I don't know, that I wrote a column for Foreign Policy a few weeks ago, which apparently turned out to be the best read column of the year so far, in which I pointed out some elementary geopolitical mistakes that the Europeans are making. And the lack of realism in geopolitics gets you into deep trouble.
Well, we'll link to that foreign policy piece in our show notes. I'm sure that our listeners would like to read it. I want to ask you about a slightly different experience you had in a very different setting, which was back in Singapore when you served as the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. You used to give a lecture to every incoming class of students in which you tried to kind of spell out the essence, the secret ingredients of Singapore's exceptional success. And you had this acronym which you used to use, MPH, which does not stand for miles per hour, but rather meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. I wonder if you could elaborate on why these three ingredients comprise the kind of secret sauce which has allowed Singapore not just to survive, but to thrive.
Well, I can, by the way, since you mentioned that I was appointed the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, I can tell you that nobody wanted that job. Because, Lee Kuan Yew had such high standards. Nobody dared to take on a job to run an institution in the name of Lee Kuan Yew, knowing full well that if you let him down, you would suffer brutal consequences. But I took that job. And the fact that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew chose me in some ways showed that he had a respect for me despite whatever differences we may have had on some issues. But on this MPH, I, as the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School, our founding mission was to help other countries succeed. The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy only had 20% of the students from Singapore, 20% from Southeast Asia, 20% from India, 20% from China, and 20% from the rest of the world. So our mission was to help the world. And I told myself, why don't I share with the students of the Lee Kuan Yew the secret behind Singapore's success? How did Singapore go from a per capita income of $500 to a per capita income of $88,000 in my lifetime, in one lifetime? And the simple answer is because of three key principles. The first is meritocracy. And meritocracy means that when you're selecting the economics team of your country, you pick the best people to be in that economics team. And to explain that, I said, listen, when a country selects its football team, the president would never appoint his cousin, his nephew, his uncle, or his brother-in-law to serve and play football for his country. They will pick the best players. But I say, strangely, when it comes to a more important game called economic competition, guess what? He appoints his brother-in-law and his cousin and his nephew, and this happens so often. And that's what brings countries down. It's corruption. So pick the best people, and that's what Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Raja did. And that's the first principle of meritocracy. Second, pragmatism. And here, Dr. Goh Keng Swee was the man who was the architect of Singapore's economic miracle. Just ask himself a simple question. Which was the first Asian country to succeed? Answer, Japan. How did Japan succeed? Well, Japan in the Meiji Restoration sent its best people all over the world to learn best practices from all over the world. And so the Japanese learned how to build an army from the Germans, how to build a navy from the British, how to establish a legal code from the French, how to establish an economy from the Americans. And he said, listen, it's very simple. We in Singapore, we must go and learn from the rest of the world. So he said, Dr. Goh Keng Swee said to me, he said, no matter what problem Singapore encounters, it's never a new problem. Somebody somewhere has encountered that problem. Why don't you go and learn how other countries have solved that problem and adapt the solution to our use? So Singapore became the best copycat country in the world. And funny, any country can become a good copycat country in the world. India can become, and by the way, China has learned a lot from Singapore's experience of copying from other countries also. And then, of course, but the hardest one is not meritocracy or pragmatism, it's honesty. And by a huge freak accident, we ended up with 3 and others brutally honest leaders who didn't take a penny from anyone. And that's why, Singapore, which has got no natural resources at all, zero. Singapore, as you know, is tiny, now has foreign reserves which are among the highest in the world, probably the highest in the world in per capita terms. Hundreds of billions of dollars of reserves. How did that happen? Sheer honesty. The leaders didn't take a penny. And I told the students of Lee Kuan Yew School that if you can go back and if you can run your country with MPH, I guarantee you, your country will succeed like Singapore.
So we sort of danced around the issue of geopolitics throughout this conversation, but maybe this is a natural place to sort of end, Kishore. Towards the very end of the book, you write that the explosion of cultural self-confidence among many Asian societies has been a transformative and joyous event to see and to participate in. And, in other books and other essays, you've written extensively about the shift in the balance of power away from the West and towards Asia. And I guess I'm wondering how you assess Asia's current moment. We have Donald Trump in the White House. You have Europe in many ways, which is reeling. You have a Russian economy, a Chinese economy, which are hurting. How do you see the future of Asia circa 2025?
Well, I can tell you that the reason why I can speak with great confidence about the explosion of cultural confidence in Asia is that I have actually experienced the exact opposite. I can tell you that growing up as a child in Singapore, in a British colony, as a child studying in a British colony, I believed quite deeply and very powerfully that I, as an Asian with my brown skin, I was inferior intellectually, culturally, spiritually to the white man. And I always believed that the white men were a superior species and we Asians, we were an inferior species. And I can tell you that if you haven't experienced that mental colonization in the way that I experienced it myself, you don't understand what it is to lose your cultural self-confidence. So having experienced the exact opposite of cultural self-confidence, which is a deep-seated cultural inferiority complex, I can now understand how much Asia has changed, how much it has transformed itself. And today, when I see my fellow Asians and they have to go and compete at the best Ivy League universities, I can tell you that the white folks down there are frightened when they have Indians and Chinese in their class because they're afraid they won't get a chance to top the class. And frankly, and this is another outrageous statement I'm going to make, that if Harvard and Yale and other places actually perform real meritocracy and admitted students not on the basis of ethnic affiliation or their citizenship, but purely on the basis of their intellectual promise and potential, you might end up with having classrooms in Harvard and Yale filled with half Indians, half Chinese. I mean that's it's amazing to me that I've gone from a position of believing that the Asians were naturally inferior, then maybe just as good, to now a situation where I feel that the Asians today are coming back to where they were for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years of human history, which meant that they were on par with the rest of the world. And frankly, for many centuries, both China and India were way ahead of their Western counterparts in various points of history. And this is all going to come out, And I can tell you, I have absolutely no doubt that the 21st century will be the Asian century, because the Asians have rediscovered their, cultural confidence in a dramatic way. And by the way, the rest of the world is also discovering it. In my 9th book, before this book, Living the Asian Century, which is an open access book called The Asian 21st Century, the publisher, Springer Nature, expected 20,000 downloads of this free book. Instead, there have been over 3.9 million downloads of this free book in 160 countries. Now, just imagine that. The publisher's target was 20,000 downloads, and there have been 3.9 million downloads, showing that the whole world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century. So you're right, a large part of my writings is trying to help the West understand that you can no longer dominate the world in the way that you used to. You should now learn to treat the rest of the world, especially the Asian societies, as your equals, as your peers. And amazingly, maybe you should learn a lesson or two from them. And frankly, why aren't the Europeans asking themselves a simple question? Why has there been no major war in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia for 45 years? And why have there been so many wars on the periphery of Europe, including the Ukraine war? Why don't you come and learn from us? And so this is the fundamental turn that human history has taken, and I've been very privileged to live through this moment, and also equally privileged to be able to write about this great turning point in human history, because I can tell you that when I published a book called The New Asian Hemisphere, 2008, Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard University, gave me a wonderful blurb, and he said, 300 years from now, nobody will remember the Cold War. Nobody will remember 9/11. What people will remember is the great rise of Asia. And that's the big story.
My guest on the show this week is the author, scholar, diplomat Kishore Mahbubani. He is a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute, which is part of the National University of Singapore. He's also the author of a brand new memoir titled Living the Asian Century, an undiplomatic memoir. Here's what Martin Wolf of the Financial Times had to say, picking up on your final point, Kishore. He says of the book, it's far more than the fascinating autobiography of a man who is arguably Asia's most influential thinker on today's transforming global order. The experiences and achievements of his life as a student, a diplomat, a commentator also provide important lessons for Westerners. Not least, it will help them understand how an informed and favorably disposed outsider judges both their historic achievements and recent follies. Kishore, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on, Dylan.
Granthamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.